So you want to create a widget and bind an action to it without using a button. Here is how using C++. First, we need to create a few things, namely exposing the input action that we want to bind using an edit anywhere field and also giving a category so it's easier to find in the details panel. We will also need a UI action binding handle, which we'll use as our entry point to the action to bind and unbind it. Once we've created those two, we can override the native construct and native destruct functions just so we have an entry point where to bind and unbind our actions. In the native construct, we can now create a fbind UI action args, which is a set of arguments we'll use to register our action. Inside those, we can pass our input action, we can pass whether or not we want to display this in the action bar, and also the callback, which will be executed when the button is pressed. To add this callback, I will create an fsimple delegate action response, which will later bind to a U function. Now that we have got our callback set up, we can now carry on to registering our UI action binding using the register UI action binding function provided by the common user widget. This will take in the arguments that we've just created, and it also returns a handle, which is why we've already cached our action widget handle in the header file. So let's assign this to the return value. Backtracking to the action response, make sure you create a void function with no parameters and pass it into our binding using bindUObject. You can also bind this by using a weak lambda if you prefer here. Lastly, let's make sure that we do also unbind our action in the native destruct, and make sure that you do this before calling the super function. Just to demonstrate that this works, I will create a binding to my color image and now set the color and opacity whenever the button is pressed to visualize that my binding is working as intended. Finally, let's go back to Unreal and make sure that we bind our action widget to the class that we've just created by setting the parent, and now in the details panel we should be able to see the binding to the action input that we've created. Do keep in mind that for this to work, the action that you are binding in the details panel needs to be mapped into an IMC, and your input mode must be at least game and UI or UI only for this to be processed, because the register UI action binding only works in UI context. As always, thanks for watching.